American Civil War. United States history. American Civil War, also called War Between the States, 4-Year War, 1861–65, between the United States and 11 Southern states that seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. Prelude to war. The secession of the Southern states, in chronological order: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, in 1860–61, and the ensuing outbreak of armed hostilities were the culmination of decades of growing sectional friction over slavery. Between 1815 and 1861, the economy of the northern states was rapidly modernizing and diversifying. Although agriculture, mostly smaller farms that relied on free labor, remained the dominant sector in the North, industrialization had taken root there. Moreover, Northerners had invested heavily in an expansive and varied transportation system that included canals, roads, steamboats, and railroads, in financial industries such as banking and insurance, and in a large communications network that featured inexpensive, widely available newspapers, magazines, and books, along with the telegraph. By contrast, the Southern economy was based principally on large farms, plantations, that produced commercial crops such as cotton and that relied on slaves as the main labor force. Rather than invest in factories or railroads as Northerners had done, Southerners invested their money in slaves, even more than in land. By 1860, 84% of the capital invested in manufacturing was invested in the free, non-slaveholding states. Yet, to Southerners, as late as 1860, this appeared to be a sound business decision. The price of cotton, the South's defining crop, had skyrocketed in the 1850s, and the value of slaves, who were, after all, property, rose commensurately. By 1860, the per capita wealth of Southern whites was twice that of Northerners, and 3/5 of the wealthiest individuals in the country were Southerners. The extension of slavery into new territories and states had been an issue as far back as the Northwest Ordinance of 1784. When the slave territory of Missouri sought statehood in 1818, Congress debated for 2 years before arriving upon the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This was the first of a series of political deals that resulted from arguments between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces over the expansion of the peculiar institution, as it was known, into the West. The end of the Mexican-American War in 1848 and the roughly 500,000 square miles, 1.3 million square kilometers, of new territory that the United States gained as a result of it added a new sense of urgency to the dispute. More and more Northerners, driven by a sense of morality or an interest in protecting free labor, came to believe, in the 1850s, that bondage needed to be eradicated. White Southerners feared that limiting the expansion of slavery would consign the institution to certain death. Over the course of the decade, the two sides became increasingly polarized and politicians less able to contain the dispute through compromise. When Abraham Lincoln, the candidate of the explicitly anti-slavery Republican Party, won the 1860 presidential election, 7 Southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, carried out their threat and seceded, organizing as the Confederate States of America. In the early morning hours of April 12, 1861, rebels opened fire on Fort Sumter, at the entrance to the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Curiously, this first encounter of what would be the bloodiest war in the history of the United States claimed no victims. After a 34-hour bombardment, Major Robert Anderson surrendered his command of about 85 soldiers to some 5,500 besieging Confederate troops under Pgt. Beauregard. Within weeks, 4 more Southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, left the Union to join the Confederacy. With war upon the land, President Lincoln called for 75,000 militiamen to serve for 3 months. He proclaimed a naval blockade of the Confederate States, although he insisted that they did not legally constitute a sovereign country but were instead states in rebellion. He also directed the Secretary of the Treasury to advance $2 million to assist in the raising of troops, and he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, first along the East Coast and ultimately throughout the country. The Confederate government had previously authorized a call for 100,000 soldiers for at least 6 months' service, and this figure was soon increased to 400,000. Winfield Scott was the Federal General-in-Chief when Lincoln took office. The 75-year-old Scott, a hero of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, was a magnificent and distinguished soldier whose mind was still keen, but he was physically incapacitated and had to be retired from the service on November 1, 1861. Scott was replaced by young George B. McClellan, who was an excellent organizer. McClellan, however, lacked tenacity, persistently overestimated the Confederates' strength, and therefore stalled his attacks, and was openly disdainful of the president. Because he wanted McClellan to focus his attentions on the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln relieved McClellan as General-in-Chief on March 11, 1862. Henry W. Halleck, who proved to be a strong administrator but did little in the way of strategic planning, succeeded McClellan on July 11 and held the position until he was replaced by Ulysses S. Grant on March 9, 1864. Halleck then became Chief of Staff under Grant in a long-needed streamlining of the Federal High Command. Grant served efficaciously as General-in-Chief throughout the remainder of the war. After the initial call by Lincoln and Davis for troops, and as the war lengthened indeterminately, both sides turned to raising massive armies of volunteers. Local citizens of prominence and means would organize regiments that were uniformed and accoutred at first under the aegis of the states and then mustered into the service of the Union and Confederate governments. On each side, the presidents appointed so-called political generals, men who had little or no military training or experience, but had important political connections, for example, Northern Democrats, or had ties to immigrant communities. Although successful politically, most of these appointments did not yield happy military results. As the war dragged on, the two governments had to resort to conscription to fill the ranks being so swiftly thinned by battle casualties. Strategic plans. The Land War in 1861. The first military operations took place in northwestern Virginia, where non-slaveholding pro-Union Virginians sought to secede from the Confederacy. McClellan, in command of federal forces in southern Ohio, advanced on his own initiative in the early summer of 1861 into western Virginia with about 20,000 men. He encountered smaller forces sent there by Lee, who was then in Richmond in command of all Virginia troops. Although showing signs of occasional hesitation, McClellan quickly won 3 small but significant battles, on June 3 at Philippi, on July 11 at Rich Mountain, and on July 13 at Carrick's, or Corrick's, Ford, all now in West Virginia. McClellan's casualties were light, and his victories went far toward eliminating Confederate resistance in northwestern Virginia, which had refused to recognize secession, and toward paving the way for the admittance into the Union of the new state of West Virginia in 1863. Meanwhile, sizable armies were gathering around the federal capital of Washington, D.C., and the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, which was about 100 miles, 160 kilometers, south of Washington. Federal forces abandoned positions in Virginia, including, on April 18, Harper's Ferry, now in West Virginia, which was quickly occupied by Southern forces, who held it for a time, and the naval base at Norfolk, which was prematurely abandoned to the Confederacy on April 20. On May 6 Lee ordered a Confederate force, soon to be commanded by P.G.T. Beauregard, northward to hold the rail hub of Manassas Junction, Virginia, some 26 miles, 42 kilometers, southwest of Washington. With Lincoln's approval, Scott appointed Irvin McDowell to command the main federal army that was being hastily collected near Washington. But political pressure and Northern public opinion impelled Lincoln, against Scott's advice, to order McDowell's still untrained army to push the Confederates back from Manassas. Meanwhile, Federal forces were to hold Confederate soldiers under Joseph E. Johnston in the Shenandoah Valley near Winchester, Virginia, thus preventing them from reinforcing Beauregard along the Bull Run near Manassas. McDowell advanced from Washington on July 16 with some 28,000 men and moved slowly toward Bull Run. 2 days later, a reconnaissance in force, an attack by a large force to determine the size and strength of the enemy, was repulsed by the Confederates at Mitchell's Ford and Blackburn's Ford. When McDowell attacked on July 21 in the First Battle of Bull Run, he discovered that Johnston had escaped the Federals in the valley and had joined Beauregard near Manassas just in time, bringing the total Confederate force to about 32,000. The battle came to be known in the South as the Battle of First Manassas. Civil War battles often had one name in North, which was usually associated with a prominent nearby physical feature, and another name in the South, usually derived from the town or city closest to the battlefield. McDowell's sharp attacks with Green troops forced the equally untrained Southerners back a bit, but a strong defensive stand by Thomas Jonathan Jackson, who thereby gained the nickname Stonewall, enabled the Confederates to check and finally throw back the Federals in the afternoon. The Federal retreat to Washington soon became a rout. McDowell lost 2,896 men, killed, wounded, and missing including prisoners, against a Southern loss of 1,982. Both sides now settled down to a long war, but the First Battle of Bull Run left a lasting impression on both the Confederacy and the Union. Confederates took their victory as confirmation of their belief that a single rebel soldier was worth 10 Yankees, an overconfident and dangerously unrealistic mindset. On the Union side, the loss seems to have infected the high command of the Army of the Potomac with both an inferiority complex and a wary fear of Southern military proficiency. This attitude was in evidence until Grant became the general in charge of all the armies in the spring of 1864. The War in 1862. The year 1862 marked a major turning point in the war, especially the War in the East, as Lee took command of the Confederate Army, which he promptly renamed the Army of Northern Virginia. With Lee's ascent, the Army of the Potomac found itself repeatedly battered. While the Army of the Potomac was beleaguered by less than visionary leadership, Union forces in the West experienced far greater success under more aggressive generals. Paradoxically, Lee kept the Confederate war effort going long enough for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which struck at the very institution the South had gone to war to protect. The War in the East. Fresh from his victories in Western Virginia, McClellan was called to Washington to replace Scott. There he began to mold the Army of the Potomac into a resolute, effective shield and sword of the Union. But personality clashes and unrelenting opposition to McClellan from the radical Republicans in Congress hampered the sometimes tactless general, who was a Democrat. It took time to drill, discipline, and equip this force of considerably more than 100,000 men, but, as fall blended into winter, loud demands arose that McClellan advance against Johnston's Confederate forces at Centreville and Manassas in Virginia. McClellan fell seriously ill with typhoid fever in December, and when he had recovered weeks later, he found that Lincoln, desperately eager for action, had ordered him to advance on February 22, 1862. Long debates ensued between president and commander. These disagreements led the obstreperous and balky McClellan to make statements and take actions that would have been, and indeed were, considered insubordinate by almost anyone other than the extremely patient Lincoln. When in March McClellan finally began his Peninsular Campaign, he discovered that Lincoln and Stanton had withheld large numbers of his command in front of Washington for the defense of the capital, forces that actually were not needed there. Upon taking command of the army in the field, McClellan was relieved of his duties as general-in-chief.
The Peninsular Campaign. Advancing up the historic peninsula between the York and James Rivers in Virginia, McClellan began a month-long siege of Yorktown and captured that stronghold on May 4, 1862. A Confederate rearguard action at Williamsburg the next day delayed the Blueclads, who then slowly moved up through heavy rain to within 4 miles (6 kilometers) of Richmond. Striving to seize the initiative, Johnston attacked McClellan's left wing at 7 Pines, Fair Oaks, on May 31 and, after scoring initial gains, was checked. Johnston was severely wounded, and, in a major though often overlooked development of the war, Lee, who had been serving as Davis's military advisor, succeeded him. Lee promptly renamed the command the Army of Northern Virginia. McClellan counterattacked on June 1 and forced the Southerners back into the environs of Richmond. The Federals suffered a total of 5,031 casualties out of a force of nearly 100,000, while the Confederates lost 6,134 of about 74,000 men. As McClellan inched forward toward Richmond in June, Lee prepared a counterstroke. He recalled from the Shenandoah Valley Jackson's forces, which had threatened Harper's Ferry and had brilliantly defeated several scattered Federal armies, and, with about 90,000 soldiers, attacked McClellan on June 26 to begin the fighting of the 7 days battles, usually dated June 25 to July 1. In the ensuing days at Mechanicsville, Gaines's Mill, Savage's Station, Fraser's Farm, Glendale, and Malvern Hill, Lee tried unsuccessfully to crush the Army of the Potomac, which McClellan was moving to another base on the James River, but the Confederate commander had at least saved Richmond. McClellan inflicted 20,614 casualties on Lee while suffering 15,849 himself. McClellan felt that he could not move upon Richmond without considerable reinforcement, and his estimates of the men he needed went up and up and up. Against his protests, his army was withdrawn from the peninsula to Washington by Lincoln and the new general-in-chief, Halleck, a man McClellan scornfully considered to be his inferior. Many of McClellan's units were given to a new Federal Army commander, John Pope, who was directed to move overland against Richmond. Second Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, and Antietam. Pope advanced confidently toward the Rappahannock River with his Army of Virginia while Lee, once McClellan had been pulled back from near Richmond, moved northward to confront Pope before he could be joined by all of McClellan's troops. Daringly splitting his army, Lee sent Jackson to destroy Pope's base at Manassas, while he himself advanced via another route with James Longstreet's half of the army. Pope opened the Second Battle of Bull Run, in the south, the Battle of Second Manassas, on August 29 with heavy but futile attacks on Jackson. The next day Lee arrived and crushed the Federal left with a massive flank assault by Longstreet, which, combined with Jackson's counterattacks, drove the Northerners back en route upon Washington. Pope lost 13,824 men out of a force of about 70,000, while Lee lost 8,353 out of about 55,000. With the Federal soldiers now lacking confidence in Pope, Lincoln relieved him and merged his forces into McClellan's Army of the Potomac. Lee followed up his advantage with his first invasion of the North, pushing as far as Frederick, Maryland. His hope was to bring Maryland, a slave state that had remained in the Union, into the Confederacy. He also felt that if he could continue to grind down civilian wool on the Union side, the North would grant the Confederacy its independence. McClellan had to reorganize his army on the march, a task that he performed capably. But McClellan could not overcome his own worst impulses. He overestimated the size of Lee's army by a factor of about 2.5. Worse, he failed to capitalize on an astonishing stroke of luck: the capture of Lee's orders, discovered on the ground wrapped around 3 cigars. Rather than striking immediately against Lee's scattered forces, McClellan waited 18 hours before moving. Finally, McClellan pressed forward and wrested the initiative from Lee by attacking and defeating a Confederate force at 3 gaps of the South Mountain between Frederick and Hagerstown on September 14. Lee fell back into a cramped defensive position along Antietam Creek, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, where he was reinforced by Jackson, who had just captured about 12,000 Federals at Harper's Ferry. After yet another delay, McClellan struck the Confederates on September 17 in the bloodiest day of the war. Although gaining some ground, the Federals were unable to drive the Confederate army into the Potomac, but Lee was compelled to retreat back into Virginia. At Antietam, McClellan lost 12,401 of some 87,000 engaged, while Lee lost 10,316 of perhaps 45,000. When McClellan did not pursue Lee as quickly as Lincoln and Halleck thought he should, he was replaced in command by Ambrose E. Burnside, an acolyte of McClellan who had been an ineffective corps commander at Antietam. Fredericksburg. Burnside delayed for a number of weeks before marching his reinforced army of 120,281 men to a point across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg, Virginia. On December 13 he ordered a series of 16 hopeless, piecemeal frontal assaults across open ground against Lee's army of 78,513 troops, drawn up in an impregnable position atop high ground and behind a stone wall. The Federals were repelled with staggering losses. Burnside lost 12,653 men, compared with Lee's 5,309. "If there is a worse place than hell, I am in it," Lincoln reportedly said. Morale in the Army of the Potomac fell further in January, when Burnside ordered a flanking maneuver against rebel forces. After an auspicious start to the march on January 20, 1863, a driving rain began that night. The Yankees quickly bogged down in what became known as the Mud March. Burnside turned back on January 23. As Federal confidence plunged, desertions rose. On January 25, 1863, Lincoln replaced Burnside with a proficient corps commander, Joseph, Fighting Joe, Hooker, who was a harsh critic of other generals and even of the president. Both armies went into winter quarters near Fredericksburg. The Emancipation Proclamation. Despite its shocking casualty figures, the most important consequence of Antietam was off the field. From the outset of the war, slaves had been pouring into Federal camps seeking safety and freedom. Early in the war, Lincoln had slapped the wrists of commanders who tried to issue emancipation edicts in areas under their control. trying to balance political and military necessity against moral imperatives. Lincoln believed that keeping the slave-owning border states, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and particularly Kentucky, in the Union was critical, and that making any move toward freeing slaves could incite those states to secede. Moreover, the Constitution protected slavery in several ways, most importantly through its defense of property rights. Finally, Lincoln believed for the first year or so of the war that a significant number of Unionists existed in the seceded states, and that, given time, those people would rise up and revolt against the Confederate government. As early as August 1861, though, slaveholders' claims to property rights had begun to erode when Congress passed its first Confiscation Act, which allowed Union troops to seize rebels' property, including slaves who fought with or worked for the Confederate military. One Union general, Benjamin Butler, a prominent attorney and politician in civilian life, read up on military law and used confiscation laws to the Union's benefit by turning the slave owner's claim to property rights on its head. Armies had always been able to confiscate property of military value, Butler argued, and slaves were instrumental in supporting the Confederate cause. With so many slaves manning factories and working fields, about 80% of eligible white Southern men wound up serving in the military. Butler declared slaves who came into his lines to be contrabands of war and therefore not liable for return to their masters. The name contrabands was used for the remainder of the war to describe slaves who ran from their masters to the Union Army. In April 1862, Congress abolished slavery in the District of Columbia and paid owners in the district about $300 on average for each slave. 3 months later, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act, which mandated that any Confederate civilian or military official who did not surrender within 60 days would have his slaves freed. 2 days after that, Congress banned slavery from the territories. Lincoln, meanwhile, was meeting with men from the border states, especially Kentucky, hoping to persuade them to agree to a compensated emancipation. Over the course of these encounters, it became clear to him that the broad Unionist sentiment he thought existed in the South was a chimera. When talks with the Kentucky delegates broke off in July, Lincoln immediately sat down and drafted the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In its final form, the Emancipation Proclamation would free the slaves in areas that were not under Union control as of January 1, 1863, when it went into effect. This meant it did not apply in the border states or places such as New Orleans, which were already under Union military occupation by that time. Lincoln realized that such a move would strike a serious blow militarily to the Confederates, who relied on bondsmen for the bulk of their labor during the war, by both demoralizing white Southerners and giving additional incentive to slaves to run away. However, the summer of 1862 had been a bleak one for Federal forces, and Lincoln did not want to issue the proclamation when the North appeared to be losing. He did not want other countries to consider it an act of desperation. So he put the document in his desk drawer and waited for a victory. Antietam, while technically a draw, was close enough that Lincoln claimed it as a Union win and announced the proclamation. This was an important turning point. The war was now a contest not just about saving the Union but also about freeing 4 million bondsmen and bondswomen. This new moral element to the war persuaded the British and French to stay out of the conflict and to never offer the Confederates the diplomatic recognition they desperately sought. African American troops. The Emancipation Proclamation also allowed black men to serve in the Union Army. This had been illegal under a federal law enacted in 1792, although African Americans had served in the Army in the War of 1812 and the law had never applied to the Navy. With their stake in the Civil War now patently obvious, African Americans joined the service in significant numbers. By the end of the war, about 180,000 African Americans were in the Army, which amounted to about 10% of the troops in that branch, and another 20,000 were serving in the Navy. Still, military service did not erase the bigotry that characterized Northern society at the time. African American soldiers were placed in segregated units, few of which saw action in battle, and their regiments were commanded by white men, see Robert Gould Shaw. Only a handful of African Americans achieved an officer's rank. Most black troops were put on guard duty or asked to build forts. The U.S. Armed Forces would not be integrated until 1948. Because they tended to be in camps, these men were at far greater risk of contracting a disease than were troops on the march. As a result, nearly 3/4 of the 40,000 African American soldiers who died in the war succumbed to either disease or infection rather than battle wounds. Initially, black troops were paid significantly less than their white counterparts. White privates made $13 a month, and their uniforms were paid for. Blacks earned $10 a month, with $3 deducted each month for uniform costs. By June 1864 this had become enough of an embarrassment that Congress deemed that white and black troops should be paid equally and made the action retroactive. African American soldiers were routinely issued equipment that was much older or poorly made in comparison with the equipment their white comrades received. Black soldiers also faced a threat that no white troops faced. When they were captured by the rebels, black troops could be put into slavery, whether they had been free or slaves before the proclamation. They also suffered much harsher treatment if they were held as prisoners of war. Despite the many disadvantages under which they labored, black troops who saw battle performed admirably. African Americans participated directly in fights at Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, Port Hudson, Louisiana, Fort Wagner, South Carolina, where the famed 54th Massachusetts Regiment lost 2/3 of its officers and nearly half its enlisted men, Petersburg, Virginia, and Nashville, Tennessee. 25 black men were awarded the Medal of Honor for their bravery during the war. The War in the West. In the Trans-Mississippi Theater, covetous Confederate eyes were cast on California, where ports for privateers could be seized, as could gold and silver to buttress a sagging treasury. Led by Henry Sibley, a Confederate force of some 2,600 invaded the Union's Department of New Mexico, where the federal commander, Edward Canby, had but 3,810 men to defend the entire vast territory. Although plagued by pneumonia and smallpox, Sibley battered a federal force at Valverde on February 21, 1862, and captured Albuquerque and Santa Fe on March 23. But at the crucial engagement of La Glorieta Pass, known also as Apache Canyon, Johnson's Ranch, or Pigeon's Ranch, a few days later, Sibley was checked and lost most of his wagon train. He had to retreat into Texas, where he reached safety in April but with only 900 men and 7 of 337 supply wagons left. Farther eastward, in the more vital Mississippi Valley, operations were unfolding as large and as important as those on the Atlantic seaboard. Missouri and Kentucky were key border states that Lincoln had to retain within the Union orbit. Commanders there, especially on the federal side, had greater autonomy than those in Virginia. Affairs began inauspiciously for the Federals in Missouri when Nathaniel Lyon's 5,000 Union troops were defeated at Wilson's Creek on August 10, 1861, by a Confederate force of more than 10,000 under Sterling Price and Benjamin McCulloch, each side losing some 1,200 men. But the Federals under Samuel Curtis decisively set back a gray-clad army under Earl Van Dorn at Pea Ridge, Elkhorn Tavern, Arkansas, on March 7 to 8, 1862, saving Missouri for the Union and threatening Arkansas. Operations in Kentucky and Tennessee. The Confederates to the east of Missouri had established a unified command under Albert Sidney Johnston, who manned, with only 40,000 men, a long line in Kentucky running from near Cumberland Gap on the east through Bowling Green to Columbus on the Mississippi River. Numerically superior Federal forces cracked this line in early 1862. First, George H. Thomas broke Johnston's right flank at Mill Springs, Somerset, Kentucky, on January 19. Then, in February, Grant, assisted by Federal gunboats commanded by Andrew H. Foote and acting under Halleck's orders, ruptured the center of the southern line in Kentucky by capturing Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson, 11 miles (18 kilometers) to the east, on the Cumberland River, both forts located in Tennessee. The Confederates suffered more than 16,000 casualties at the latter stronghold, most of them taken prisoner, against Federal losses of fewer than 3,000, and Grant's victories at Forts Henry and Donelson marked the first real successes for the Union in the war. Johnston's left anchor fell when Pope seized New Madrid, Missouri, and Island No. 10 in the Mississippi River in March and April. This forced Johnston to withdraw his remnants quickly from Kentucky through Tennessee and to reorganize them for a counterstroke. This seemingly impossible task he performed splendidly. The Confederate onslaught came at Shiloh, Tennessee, near Pittsburgh Landing, a point on the west bank of the Tennessee River to which Grant and William T. Sherman had incautiously advanced. In a Herculean effort, Johnston pulled his forces together and, with 40,000 men, suddenly struck a like number of unsuspecting Federals on April 6. Johnston hoped to crush Grant before the arrival of Don Carlos Buell's 20,000 Federal troops, approaching from Nashville, Tennessee. A desperate combat ensued, with Confederate assaults driving the Federals perilously close to the river. But, at the height of success, Johnston was mortally wounded. The Southern attack then lost momentum, and Grant held on until reinforced by Buell. On the following day the Federals counterattacked and drove the Confederates, now under Beauregard, steadily from the field, forcing them to fall back to Corinth, in northern Mississippi. Grant's victory cost him 13,047 casualties, compared with Southern losses of 10,694. Halleck then assumed personal command of the combined forces of Grant, Buell, and Pope and inched forward to Corinth, which the Confederates had evacuated on May 30. With this battle and its huge losses, the people of both the Union and the Confederacy came to realize that this war would be longer and costlier than many on either side had thought in 1861. Beauregard, never popular with Davis, was superseded by Braxton Bragg, one of the president's favorites. Bragg was an imaginative strategist and an effective drill master and organizer, but he was also a weak tactician and a martinet who was disliked by a number of his principal subordinates. Leaving 22,000 men in Mississippi under Price and Van Dorn, Bragg moved through Chattanooga, Tennessee, with 30,000 troops, hoping to reconquer the state and carry the war into Kentucky. Some 18,000 other Confederate soldiers under E. Kirby Smith were at Knoxville, Tennessee. Buell led his Federal force northward to save Louisville, Kentucky, and to force Bragg to fight. Occupying Frankfort, Kentucky, Bragg failed to move promptly against Louisville. In the ensuing Battle of Perryville on October 8, Bragg, after an early advantage, was halted by Buell and impelled to fall back to a point south of Nashville. Meanwhile, Federals under William S. Rosecrans had checked Price and Van Dorn at Aoka, Mississippi, on September 19 and had repelled their attack in the Battle of Corinth on October 3 to 4. Buell, like McClellan cautious and a Democrat, was slow in his pursuit of the retreating Confederates and, despite his success at Perryville, was relieved of his command by Lincoln on October 24. His successor, Rosecrans, was able to safeguard Nashville and then move southeastward against Bragg's army at Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He scored a partial success by bringing on the bloody Battle of Stones River, or Murfreesboro, December 31, 1862 to January 2, 1863. Again, after first having the better of the combat, Bragg was finally contained and forced to retreat. Of some 41,400 men, Rosecrans lost 12,906, while Bragg suffered 11,739 casualties out of about 34,700 effectives. Although it was a strategic victory for Rosecrans, his army was so shaken that he felt unable to advance again for 5 months, despite the urgings of Lincoln and Halleck. The war in 1863. The first half of 1863 was grim for the Union cause. In the East, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia experienced its greatest successes. Meanwhile, Union armies in the West were stifled, especially in their efforts to take Vicksburg, Mississippi. Catastrophic Confederate losses in early July, however, left Lee unable to ever take the offensive again, gave the Union control of the Mississippi River from top to bottom, and divided the Confederacy in half. Nevertheless, problems plagued both sides as the war's toll weighed increasingly on the people at home. The Copperheads. In January 1863, Lincoln was despondent about the political situation in the North. Anti-war Democrats had been in evidence since the beginning of the conflict, but the North's defeats in the summer and fall of 1862, along with the deeply divisive preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, had given the so-called peace Democrats credibility and an audience. Republicans had not fared well in the midterm elections, and a movement in the Midwestern states to break off and either join the Confederacy or start a third country seemed to be gaining ground. The fire in the rear, Lincoln told a senator, posed a greater threat to the nation than the Confederates did to its front. The Peace Democrats, dubbed Copperheads by Republicans after a poisonous snake, braided together 3 coalitions: immigrants, especially Irish and German Catholics, who had been the target of ugly discrimination by nativists and Protestant reformers and who had gravitated into the Democratic Party in the mid-1850s, people in the lower Midwest with family ties to the South, and conservative Democrats who had a strict constructionist reading of the Constitution. Poorly led and having only loose formal connections beyond county lines, Peace Democrats universally characterized themselves as conservatives worried that Lincoln and the Republicans were reaching far past constitutional bounds. They also shared a deep antipathy toward African Americans. By the summer of 1862, the rallying cry of these conservatives was, "The Union as it was, the Constitution as it is." The movement was galvanized by the suspension of habeas corpus, first on the East Coast and then throughout the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation, which confirmed the worst suspicions of the Copperheads, who believed this had always been a war about abolition rather than reunion, and conscription, which Congress approved in March 1863. Other changes that were widely accepted by most Northerners and would have major implications for the American economy for generations to come were also reviled by the Copperheads. Specifically, they believed that the income tax that was levied for the first time in the country's history and the issuance of paper currency, so-called greenbacks, were further gross violations of the Constitution that represented yet another dangerous extension of executive power. These were indeed more examples of the executive's broader power, although the income tax, like many other war measures, disappeared after the war. A nationally recognized paper currency, however, was with the country to stay. Ultimately, the Copperheads really had very little control over their own fate. Instead, The extent of their influence rested with the armies. Although they never seemed to realize it, the power of the peace Democrats waxed and waned through the war in direct opposition to how well the Union armies performed in the field. The Southern Home Front. By 1863 the war was taking a clear toll on the civilians of both sides. The Union had the Copperheads. Labor shortages and inflation also complicated life for Northerners, though on the whole the economy boomed in the North during the war. Whatever difficulties Yankees experienced paled in comparison with those of Southerners, who were plagued with shortages of food, salt, and nearly every conceivable consumer good. The shortages had myriad causes. The Union blockade shut off the import of many finished materials from Europe. Naturally, the war itself shut down official trade with the North, which had supplied the South's agrarian economy with much of its manufactured goods, and Southern industry was neither large nor well developed enough to meet demand. Deprivation was evident early in the war with the lack of such basic items as paper and ink. Civilians wrote letters on anything they could find, including sheets torn from old account books and wallpaper ripped from the walls. The Southern states, which boasted about 800 newspapers at the beginning of the war, had only 22 by the time it ended, according to a contemporary estimate. But the most pressing problem for many civilians in the Confederacy was the threat of starvation. Many causes were at the root of food shortages. A drought in 1862 drove down food supplies. Slaves who worked on farms and plantations were fleeing to Union lines. Federal troops were gaining control of more parts of the Confederacy, and, with the Confederate military having priority in terms of transportation, food earmarked for civilians went bad before it could be shipped from warehouses. When the government tried to rectify the situation by impressing food, farmers responded by hiding their crops and their livestock. Hyperinflation sent the price of food skyrocketing while the value of the Confederate dollar cratered. Food riots broke out in several cities, including Richmond. In that instance, in April 1863, Davis ordered the militia to open fire on several hundred women if they did not leave the area, which they grudgingly did. The War in the East. In the East, after both armies had spent the winter in camp, the arrival of the active 1863 campaign season was eagerly awaited, especially by Hooker. Fighting Joe had capably reorganized and refitted his army, the morale of which was high once again. The massive Army of the Potomac numbered around 132,000, the largest army formed during the war, and was termed by Hooker the finest army on the planet. It was opposed by Lee with about 62,000 troops. Hooker decided to move most of his army up the Rappahannock, cross, and come in upon the Confederate rear at Fredericksburg, while John Sedgwick's smaller force would press Lee in front. Chancellorsville. Beginning his turning movement on April 27, 1863, Hooker masterfully swung around toward the west of the Confederate Army. Thus far he had outmaneuvered Lee. But Hooker was astonished on May 1 when the Confederate commander left a small part of his force in Fredericksburg and suddenly moved the bulk of his army directly against him. Fighting Joe lost his nerve and pulled back to Chancellorsville, Virginia, in the wilderness, where the superior Federal artillery could not be used effectively. Lee followed up on May 2 by splitting his army and sending Jackson on a brilliant flanking movement against Hooker's exposed right. Bursting like a thunderbolt upon Oliver O. Howard's 11 Corps late in the afternoon, Jackson crushed this wing. While scouting the Federal forces that night, however, Jackson was accidentally shot by his own pickets and died of complications several days later. Lee resumed the attack on the morning of May 3 and slowly pushed back Hooker, who was knocked insensible by Southern artillery fire but refused to surrender his command even temporarily. That afternoon Sedgwick drove Jubal early Southerners from Mary's Heights at Fredericksburg, but Lee countermarched his weary troops, fell upon Sedgwick at Salem Church, and forced him back to the north bank of the Rappahannock. Lee then returned to Chancellorsville to resume the main engagement, but Hooker, though he had 37,000 fresh troops available, gave up the contest on May 5 and retreated across the river to his old position opposite Fredericksburg. The Federals suffered 17,278 casualties at Chancellorsville, while the Confederates lost 12,764. It was a tremendous victory for Lee. His actions, splitting his force twice in the face of an adversary double his size, are still studied in military academies for their vision and audacity. Lee emerged from the battle believing that his army, even without Jackson, was invincible, and his men emerged from the fight believing that they were invincible as long as Lee was their commander. Lee's stunning success at Chancellorsville laid the groundwork for Lee's second invasion of the North and some of the fateful decisions he would make at Gettysburg. Gettysburg. While both armies were licking their wounds and reorganizing, Hooker, Lincoln, and Halleck debated Union strategy. They were thus engaged when Lee headed north again on June 5, 1863. What his ultimate target may have been remains a historical mystery. He never told anyone. His advance elements moved down the Shenandoah Valley toward Harper's Ferry, brushing aside small Federal forces near Winchester. Marching through Maryland into Pennsylvania, the Confederates reached Chambersburg and turned eastward. They occupied York and Carlisle and menaced Harrisburg. Meanwhile, the dashing Confederate cavalryman Jeb Stuart set off on a questionable week-long ride around the Federal Army and was unable to join Lee's main army until the second day at Gettysburg. Hooker, on unfriendly terms with Lincoln and especially Halleck, moved the Federal forces northward, keeping between Lee's army and Washington. Reaching Frederick, Hooker requested that the nearly 10,000-man Federal garrison at Harper's Ferry be added to his field army. When Halleck refused, Hooker resigned his command and was succeeded June 28 by the steady George Gordon Meade, the commander of V Corps. Meade was granted a greater degree of freedom of movement than Hooker had enjoyed, and he carefully felt his way northward, looking for the Confederates. Learning to his surprise the same day that Meade took command that the Federal Army was north of the Potomac, Lee hastened to concentrate his far-flung legions. Hostile forces met unexpectedly at the important crossroads town of Gettysburg, in southern Pennsylvania, bringing on the greatest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. Attacking on July 1 from the west and north with 28,000 men, Confederate forces finally prevailed after 9 hours of desperate fighting against 18,000 Federal soldiers under John F. Reynolds. When Reynolds was killed, Abner Doubleday handled the outnumbered Federal troops, but the weight of Confederate numbers forced him back through the streets of Gettysburg to strategic Cemetery Ridge south of town, where Meade assembled the rest of the army that night. On the second day of battle, Meade's nearly 94,000 troops were ensconced in a strong fishhook-shaped defensive position running northward from the Round Top Hills along Cemetery Ridge and then eastward around Culp's Hill. Lee, with more than 71,000 troops, ordered James Longstreet to attack the Federals diagonally from Little Round Top northward and Richard S. Ewell to assail Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. The Confederate attack, coming in the late afternoon and evening, saw Longstreet capture the positions known as the Peach Orchard, Wheat Field, and Devil's Den on the Federal left in furious fighting but fail to seize the vital Little Round Top. Ewell's later assaults on Cemetery Hill were repulsed, and he could capture only a part of Culp's Hill. On the morning of the third day, Meade's right wing drove the Confederates from the lower slopes of Culp's Hill and checked Stuart's cavalry sweep to the east of Gettysburg in mid-afternoon. Then, in what has been called the greatest infantry charge in American history, Lee, against Longstreet's advice, hurled nearly 15,000 soldiers under the command of Generals George E. Pickett, J. Johnston Pettigrew, and Isaac R. Trimble against the center of Meade's lines on Cemetery Ridge, following a fearful and deafening artillery duel of 2 hours. Despite heroic efforts, only several hundred Southerners temporarily breached the low rock wall at the Federal center. The rest were shot down by Union cannoneers and riflemen, captured, or thrown back, suffering casualties of almost 60%. To Lincoln's great consternation, Meade felt unable to counterattack, and Lee retreated into Virginia. The Confederates had lost 28,063 men at Gettysburg and the Federals 23,049. After indecisive maneuvering and light actions in northern Virginia in the fall of 1863, the two armies went into winter quarters. Lee's decisions on the third day have long been the subject of debate but are best understood in the context of coming just a few weeks after his greatest victory, at Chancellorsville. But the consequences of Gettysburg, while not ultimately decisive, were catastrophic nonetheless. Lee had lost a number of his hardened veterans along with many of his generals and colonels, and they could not be replaced. Never again would Lee be able to mount a full-scale invasion of the North with his entire army. Instead, he would have to spend the rest of the war on the defensive. Just 10 days after Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, a draft riot broke out in New York City and quickly turned into a race riot. At least 120 people were killed in the 5-day melee, which remains one of the deadliest episodes of civil unrest in American history. This was neither the first nor the last draft riot to take place in the North, however. In fact, the last major riot would occur in March 1864 in Charleston, Illinois, one of the towns that had hosted a Lincoln-Douglas debate in 1858. It was the Confederates, however, who had resorted to a draft first, in April 1862. All healthy Southern white men between ages 18 and 35 were required to serve 3 years. Ultimately, this would be extended to men between ages 17 and 50. Those whose occupations were critical to society or the war effort were exempt from military service, and until December 1863 a wealthy man could hire a substitute to serve in his place. The most controversial element of the Confederate conscription was the 20-slave law, which allowed one white man from a plantation with 20 or more slaves to avoid service during the war. This was in part a response to the pleas of many Southern women, who were unprepared for and overwhelmed by the responsibility of running plantations on their own and managing a significant number of slaves. The exemption stirred cries from yeoman farmers that this had become a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. The U.S. Congress resorted to the first draft in the country's history in March 1863. As with the Confederates the year before, the inflow of volunteers was drying up, and the Union needed to keep the ranks filled. All able-bodied men between ages 20 and 45 were required to be enrolled and available for military service. Draftees were chosen by lottery. Once conscripted, a man could avoid service for that particular round of the draft either by paying a $300 commutation fee or by hiring a substitute to take his place. As in the South, this raised accusations that the war had become a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. Nevertheless, in both North and South, statistics indicate that wealthy men were represented in the service in at least the same proportion as they were in the general population. The War in the West. The surrender of Vicksburg was an important victory for the Union. It was one of several significant turning points in the war but was not decisive on its own. Confederate troops continued to put up a considerable fight, defeating Union forces at Chickamauga Creek, Georgia, and imposing great suffering at Chattanooga before finally losing that city. Arkansas and Vicksburg. In Arkansas, Federal troops under Frederick Steele moved upon the Confederates and defeated them at Prairie Grove, near Fayetteville, on December 7, 1862, a victory that paved the way for Steele's eventual capture of Little Rock the next September. More importantly, Grant, back in good graces following his undistinguished performance at Shiloh, was authorized to move against the Confederate Gibraltar of the West, Vicksburg, Mississippi. This bastion was difficult to approach. Admiral David Farragut, Grant, and Sherman had failed to capture it in 1862. In the early months of 1863, in the so-called Bayou expeditions, Grant was again frustrated in his efforts to get at Vicksburg from the north. Finally, Escorted by Admiral David Dixon Porter's gunboats, which ran the Confederate batteries at Vicksburg, Grant landed his army to the south at Bruinsburg, Mississippi, on April 30, 1863, and pressed northeastward. He won small but sharp actions at Port Gibson, Raymond, and Jackson, while the circumspect Confederate defender of Vicksburg, John C. Pemberton, was unable to link up with a smaller Southern force under Joseph E. Johnston near Jackson. Turning due westward toward the rear of Vicksburg's defenses, Grant overwhelmed Pemberton's army at Champion's Hill and the Big Black River and enveloped the town. During his 47-day siege, Grant eventually had an army of 71,000. Pemberton's command numbered 31,000, of whom 18,500 were effectives. The outnumbered and starving Confederates were forced to capitulate on July 4. 5 days later, 6,000 rebels yielded to Nathaniel P. Banks at Port Hudson, Louisiana, to the south of Vicksburg, a loss that divided the Confederacy in half. Lincoln could say, in relief, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Chickamauga and Chattanooga. Meanwhile, 60,000 Federal soldiers under Rosecrans sought to move southeastward from central Tennessee against the important Confederate rail and industrial center of Chattanooga, then held by Bragg with some 43,000 troops. In a series of brilliantly conceived movements, Rosecrans maneuvered Bragg out of Chattanooga without having to fight a battle. Bragg was then bolstered by troops from Longstreet's Veteran Corps, sent swiftly by rail from Lee's army in Virginia. With this reinforcement, Bragg turned on Rosecrans and, in a vicious two-day battle, September 19 to 20, at Chickamauga Creek, just southeast of Chattanooga, gained one of the few Confederate victories in the West. Bragg lost 18,454 of his 66,326 men, Rosecrans, 16,170 out of 53,919 engaged. Rosecrans fell back into Chattanooga, where he was almost encircled by Bragg. Bragg was able to choke off supplies to the point that Union troops were starving. But the Southern success was short-lived. Instead of pressing the siege of Chattanooga, Bragg unwisely sent Longstreet off in a futile attempt to capture Knoxville, then being held by Burnside. When Rosecrans showed signs of disintegration, Lincoln replaced him with Grant, who was able to establish a supply line by late October and strengthened the hard-pressed Federal Army at Chattanooga by sending, by rail, the remnants of the Army of the Potomac's 11 and 12 Corps, under Hooker's command. Outnumbering Bragg in now 56,359 to 46,165, Grant attacked on November 23 to 25, capturing Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, defeating Bragg's army, and driving it southward toward Dalton, Georgia. Grant sustained 5,824 casualties at Chattanooga and Bragg, 6,667. Confidence having been lost in Bragg by most of his top generals, Davis replaced him with Johnston. Both armies remained quiescent until the following spring. The war in 1864–65. Finally dissatisfied with Halleck as general-in-chief and impressed with Grant's victories, Lincoln appointed Grant to supersede Halleck and to assume the rank of lieutenant general, which Congress had recreated. Leaving Sherman in command in the West, Grant arrived in Washington on March 8, 1864. He was given largely a free hand in developing his grand strategy. He retained Meade in technical command of the Army of the Potomac but in effect assumed direct control by establishing his own headquarters with it. He sought to move this army against Lee in northern Virginia while Sherman marched against Johnston and Atlanta. Several lesser Federal armies were also to advance in May. Grant's Overland Campaign. Grant surged across the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers in Virginia on May 4, hoping to get through the tangled wilderness before Lee could move. But the Confederate leader reacted instantly and, on May 5, attacked Grant from the west in the Battle of the Wilderness. 2 days of bitter, indecisive combat ensued. Although Grant had 115,000 men available against Lee's 62,000, he found both Federal flanks endangered. Moreover, Grant lost 17,666 soldiers, compared with a probable Southern loss of about 8,000. Pulling away from the wilderness battlefield, Grant tried to hasten southeastward to the crossroads point of Spotsylvania Court House, only to have the Confederates get there first. In savage action, May 8 to 19th, including hand-to-hand fighting at the famous Bloody Angle, Grant, although gaining a little ground, was essentially thrown back. He had lost 18,399 men at Spotsylvania. Lee's combined losses at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania were an estimated 17,250. Again Grant withdrew, only to move forward in another series of attempts to get past Lee's right flank. Again, at the North Anna River and at Totopotomoy Creek, he found Lee confronting him. Finally, at Cold Harbor, just northeast of Richmond, Grant launched several heavy attacks, including a frontal, nearly suicidal one on June 3, only to be repelled with grievous total losses of 12,737. Lee's casualties are unknown but were much lighter. Grant, with the vital rail center of Petersburg, the southern key to Richmond, as his objective, made one final effort to swing around Lee's right and finally outguessed his opponent and stole a march on him. But several blunders by Federal officers, swift action by Beauregard, and Lee's belated though rapid reaction enabled the Confederates to hold Petersburg. Grant attacked on June 15 and 18, hoping to break through before Lee could consolidate the Confederate lines east of the city, but he was contained with 8,150 losses. Unable to admit defeat but having failed to destroy Lee's army and capture Richmond, Grant settled down to a 9-month active siege of Petersburg. The summer and fall of 1864 were highlighted by the Federal failure with a mine explosion under the Gray Lines at Petersburg on July 30, the Battle of the Crater, the near capture of Washington by the Confederate Jubal early in July, and Early's later setbacks in the Shenandoah Valley at the hands of Philip H. Sheridan. Sherman's Georgia campaigns and total war. Meanwhile, Sherman was pushing off toward Atlanta from Dalton, Georgia, on May 7, 1864, with 110,123 men against Johnston's 55,000. This masterly campaign comprised a series of cat-and-mouse moves by the rival commanders. 9 successive defensive positions were taken up by Johnston. Trying to outguess his opponent, Sherman attempted to swing around the Confederate right flank twice and around the left flank the other times, but each time Johnston divined which way Sherman was moving and each time pulled back in time to thwart him. At one point Sherman's patience snapped, and he frontally assaulted the Southerners at Kennesaw Mountain, Georgia, on June 27. Johnston threw him back with heavy losses. All the while Sherman's lines of communication in his rear were being menaced by audacious Confederate cavalry raids conducted by Nathan Bedford Forrest and Joseph Wheeler. Forrest administered a crushing defeat to Federal troops under Samuel D. Sturgis at Bryce's Cross Roads, Mississippi, on June 10. But these Confederate forays were more annoying than decisive, and Sherman pressed forward. When Johnston finally informed Davis that he could not realistically hope to annihilate Sherman's mighty army, the Confederate president replaced him with John B. Hood, who had already lost 2 limbs in the war. Hood inaugurated a series of premature offensive battles at Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, Ezra Church, and Jonesboro, but he was repulsed in each of them. With his communications threatened, Hood evacuated Atlanta on the night of August 31 to September 1. Sherman pursued only at first. Then, on November 15, he commenced his great march to the sea with 62,000 men, laying waste to the economic resources of Georgia in a 50-mile, 80 km, wide swath of destruction. He captured Savannah, 285 miles, 460 kilometers, from Atlanta, on December 21. Sherman's march to the sea marked a new development in the war. To this point, Union armies had generally avoided targeting civilians and their property other than slaves. Sherman had decided, though, that he had to crush the will of white Southern civilians if the Union were to bring the rebels to heel. He promised to make Georgia howl and he did. His men destroyed everything of military value that they encountered, including railroads, telegraph lines, and warehouses. They were trailed by foragers, stragglers, deserters, Georgia militiamen, local ne'er-do-wells, and some Confederate cavalry who committed a variety of depredations on the population, including pillaging and burning civilian property. Sherman became the bête noire of the South not only for his own actions but also because he was blamed for the actions of others not necessarily under his control. Nevertheless, Sherman himself reported that his men had racked up $100 million in damage to Georgia, 80% of which was simple waste and destruction, and the remainder being straightforward military targets. Because civilians were not killed, historians have debated whether this was an instance of total war, other examples being the bombing of Dresden, Tokyo, or Hiroshima during World War II, or one of hard war. Hood had sought unsuccessfully to lure Sherman out of Georgia and back into Tennessee by marching northwestward with nearly 40,000 men toward the key city of Nashville, the defense of which had been entrusted by Sherman to George H. Thomas. At Franklin, Hood was checked for a day with severe casualties by a Federal holding force under John M. Schofield. This helped Thomas to retain Nashville, where on December 15 to 16 he delivered a crushing counterstroke against Hood's besieging army, cutting it up so badly that it was of little use thereafter. Western campaigns. Sherman's force might have been larger and his Atlanta-Savannah campaign consummated much sooner had not Lincoln approved the Red River Campaign in Louisiana led by Banks in the spring of 1864. Accompanied by Porter's warships, Banks moved up the Red River with some 40,000 men. He had two objectives: to capture Cotton and to defeat Southern forces under Kirby Smith and Richard Taylor. Not only did he fail to net much cotton but also he was checked with loss on April 8 at Sabine Cross Roads, Louisiana, and forced to retreat. Porter lost several gunboats, and the campaign amounted to a costly debacle. That fall Kirby Smith ordered the reconquest of Missouri. Sterling Price's Confederate army advanced on a broad front into Missouri but was set back temporarily by Thomas Ewing at Pilot Knob on September 27. Resuming the advance toward St. Louis, Price was forced westward along the south bank of the Missouri River by pursuing Federal troops under A.J. Smith, Alfred Pleasonton, and Samuel Curtis. Finally, on October 23, at Westport, near Kansas City, Price was decisively defeated and forced to retreat along a circuitous route, arriving back in Arkansas on December 2. This ill-fated raid cost Price most of his artillery as well as the greater part of his army, which numbered about 12,000. Sherman's Carolina campaigns. On January 10, 1865, with Tennessee and Georgia now securely in Federal hands, Sherman's 60,000-man force began to march northward into the Carolinas. It was only lightly opposed by much smaller Confederate forces. Sherman's men blamed South Carolina for bringing on the war and sought to punish them for their actions. What had happened in Georgia paled in comparison with the devastation the Yankees wrought in South Carolina. Once again, civilians were not killed, but the Union troops did everything they could to demoralize the population and undermine their support for the war. Sherman captured Columbia, South Carolina, on February 17 and compelled the Confederates to evacuate Charleston, including Fort Sumter. When Lee was finally named Confederate General-in-Chief, he promptly reinstated Johnston as commander of the small forces striving to oppose the Federal advance. Nonetheless, Sherman pushed on into North Carolina, capturing Fayetteville on March 11 and, after an initial setback, repulsing the counterattacking Johnston at Bentonville on March 19 to 20. Goldsboro fell to the Federals on March 23 and Raleigh on April 13. Finally, perceiving that he no longer had any reasonable chance of containing the relentless Federal advance, Johnston surrendered to Sherman at the Bennett House near Durham Station on April 18. When Sherman's generous terms proved unacceptable to Secretary of War Stanton, Lincoln had been assassinated on April 14, The former submitted new terms that Johnston signed on April 26. The final land operations. Grant and Meade were continuing their siege of Petersburg and Richmond early in 1865. For months the Federals had been lengthening their left, southern, flank while operating against several important railroads supplying the two Confederate cities. This stretched Lee's dwindling forces very thin. The Southern leader briefly threatened to break the siege when he attacked and captured Fort Stedman on March 25. But an immediate Federal counterattack regained the strongpoint, and Lee, when his lines were subsequently pierced, evacuated both Petersburg and Richmond on the night of April 2 to 3. An 88-mile (142 kilometers) pursuit west-southwestward along the Appomattox River in Virginia ensued, with Grant and Meade straining every nerve to bring Lee to bay. The Confederates were detained at Amelia Court House, awaiting delayed food supplies, and were badly cut up at Five Forks and Sailor's Creek, with their only avenue of escape now cut off by Sheridan and George Custer. When Lee's final attempt to break out failed, he surrendered the remnants of his Army of Northern Virginia at the McLean House at Appomattox Court House on April 9. The lamp of magnanimity was reflected in Grant's unselfish terms. On the periphery of the Confederacy, 43,000 gray-clad soldiers in Louisiana under Smith surrendered to Canby on May 26. The port of Galveston, Texas, yielded to the Federals on June 2, and the greatest war on American soil was over. The Naval War. While the Federal armies actually stamped out Confederate land resistance, the increasingly effective Federal naval effort must not be overlooked. If Union sea power did not win the war, it enabled the war to be won. When hostilities opened, the U.S. Navy numbered 90 warships, of which only 42 were in commission, and many of these were on foreign station. Fortunately for the Federals, Lincoln had, in the person of Gideon Welles, a wise Secretary of the Navy who was one of his most competent cabinet members. Welles was ably seconded by his assistant, Gustavus Vasa Fox. By the time of Lee's surrender, Lincoln's Navy numbered 626 warships, of which 65 were ironclads. From a tiny force of nearly 9,000 seamen in 1861, the Union Navy increased by war's end to about 59,000 sailors, whereas naval appropriations per year leaped from approximately $12 million to perhaps $123 million. The blockade of about 3,500 miles, 5,600 kilometers, of Confederate coastline was a factor of incalculable value in the final defeat of the Davis government, although the blockade did not become truly effective before the end of 1863. The Confederates, on the other hand, had to start from almost nothing in building a navy. That they did so well was largely because of untiring efforts by the capable Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory. He dispatched agents to Europe to purchase warships, sought to refurbish captured or scuttled Federal vessels, and made every effort to arm and employ Southern-owned ships then in Confederate ports. Mallory's only major omission was his delay in seeing the advantage of Confederate government control of blockade runners bringing in strategic supplies. Not until later in the war did the government begin closer supervision of blockade-running vessels. Eventually, the government commandeered space on all privately owned blockade runners and even built and operated some of its own late in the war. The naval side of the Civil War was a revolutionary one. In addition to their increasing use of steam power, the screw propeller, shell guns, and rifled ordnance, both sides built and employed ironclad warships. The notable clash on March 9, 1862, between the North's Monitor and the South's Virginia, formerly the Merrimac, was the first battle ever waged between ironclads. Also, the first sinking of a warship by a submarine occurred on February 17, 1864, when the Confederate submersible Hunley sank the blockader USS Housatonic. daring Confederate sea raiders preyed upon Union commerce. Especially successful were the Sumter, commanded by Raphael Semmes, which captured 18 northern merchantmen early in the war, the Florida, captained by John Maffitt, which in 1863 seized 37 Federal prizes in the North and South Atlantic, and the Shenandoah, with James Waddell as skipper, which took 38 Union merchant ships, mostly in the Pacific. But the most famous of all the Confederate cruisers was the Alabama, commanded by Semmes, which captured 69 Federal ships in 2 years. Not until June 19, 1864, was the Alabama intercepted and sunk off Cherbourg, France, by the Federal warship Kearsarge, captained by John Winslow. A great many other Federal ships were captured, and marine insurance rates were driven to a prohibitive high by these southern depredations. This led to a serious deterioration of the American merchant marine, the effects of which lasted into the 20th century. Besides fighting efficaciously with ironclads on the inland rivers, Lincoln's Navy played an important role in a series of coastal and amphibious operations, some in conjunction with the Federal Army. As early as November 7, 1861, a Federal flotilla under Samuel Francis DuPont seized Port Royal, South Carolina, and another squadron under Lewis M. Goldsborough assisted Burnside's army in capturing Roanoke Island and New Bern on the North Carolina littoral in February-March 1862. 1 month later, Savannah, Georgia, was closed to Confederate blockade runners when the Federal Navy reduced Fort Pulaski guarding the city, and on April 25 David Farragut, running the forts near the mouth of the Mississippi, took New Orleans, which was subsequently occupied by Benjamin F. Butler's army. But in April 1863 and again in July and August, Federal warships were repelled at Fort Sumter when they descended upon Charleston, and a Federal army under Quincy A. Gilmore fared little better when it tried to assist. Farragut had better luck, however, when he rendered Mobile, Alabama, useless by reducing Fort Morgan and destroying several defending Confederate ships on August 5, 1864, in the hardest-fought naval action of the war. The Confederacy's last open Atlantic port, Wilmington, North Carolina, successfully withstood a Federal naval attack by Porter on defending Fort Fisher when Butler's army failed to coordinate its attack properly in December 1864, but it fell 1 month later to Porter and to an ably conducted army assault led by Alfred H. Terry. Only Galveston remained open to the Confederates in the last months of the war. In short, Uncle Sam's web feet, as Lincoln termed the Union Navy, played a decisive role in helping to defeat the Confederacy. The cost and significance of the Civil War. Above and beyond its superior naval forces, numbers, and industrial and financial resources, the triumph of the North was partly due to the statesmanship of Lincoln, who by 1864 had become a masterful political and war leader, as well as to the increasing skill of Federal officers. The victory can also be attributed in part to failures of Confederate transportation, material, and political leadership, despite the strategic and tactical dexterity of such generals as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Joseph E. Johnston. While desertions plagued both sides, the personal valor and the enormous casualties, both in absolute numbers and in percentage of numbers engaged, have not yet ceased to astound scholars and military historians. On the basis of the 3-year standard of enlistment, about 1,556,000 soldiers served in the Federal armies, and about 800,000 men probably served in the Confederate forces, though spotty records make it impossible to know for sure. Traditionally, historians have put war deaths at about 360,000 for the Union and 260,000 for the Confederates. In the second decade of the 21st century, however, a demographer used better data and more sophisticated tools to convincingly revise the total death toll upward to 752,000 and indicated that it could be as high as 851,000. The enormous death rate, roughly 2% of the 1860 population of the U.S., died in the war, had an enormous impact on American society. Americans were deeply religious, and they struggled to understand how a benevolent God could allow such destruction to go on for so long. understanding of the nature of the afterlife shifted as Americans, North and South, comforted themselves with the notion that heaven looked like their front parlors. A new mode of dealing with corpses emerged with the advent of embalming, an expensive method of preservation that helped wealthier families to bring their dead sons, brothers, or fathers home. Finally, a network of federal military cemeteries, and private Confederate cemeteries, grew out of the need to bury the men in uniform who had succumbed to wounds or disease. Some have called the American Civil War the last of the old-fashioned wars, others have termed it the first modern war. Actually, it was a transitional war, and it had a profound impact, technologically, on the development of modern weapons and techniques. There were many innovations. It was the first war in history in which ironclad warships clashed, the first in which the telegraph and railroad played significant roles, the first to use, extensively, rifled ordnance and shell guns and to introduce a machine gun, the Gatling gun, the first to have widespread newspaper coverage, voting by servicemen in the field in national elections, and photographic recordings, the first to organize medical care of troops systematically, and the first to use land and water mines and to employ a submarine that could sink a warship. It was also the first war in which armies widely employed aerial reconnaissance, by means of balloons. The Civil War has been written about as few other wars in history have. More than 60,000 books and countless articles give eloquent testimony to the accuracy of poet Walt Whitman's prediction that a great literature will arise out of the era of those 4 years. The events of the war left a rich heritage for future generations, and that legacy was summed up by the martyred Lincoln as showing that the reunited sections of the United States constituted the last best hope of earth. Top questions. What caused the American Civil War? The American Civil War was the culmination of the struggle between the advocates and opponents of slavery that dated from the founding of the United States. This sectional conflict between northern states and slaveholding southern states had been tempered by a series of political compromises, but by the late 1850s the issue of the extension of slavery to the western states had reached a boiling point. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a member of the anti-slavery Republican Party, as president in 1860 precipitated the secession of 11 southern states, leading to a civil war. Who won the American Civil War? The Union won the American Civil War. The war effectively ended in April 1865 when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his troops to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Court House in Virginia. The final surrender of Confederate troops on the western periphery came in Galveston, Texas, on June 2. How many people died during the American Civil War? It is estimated that from 752,000 to 851,000 soldiers died during the American Civil War. This figure represents approximately 2% of the American population in 1860. The Battle of Gettysburg, one of the bloodiest engagements during the Civil War, resulted in about 7,000 deaths and 51,000 total casualties. Who were the most important figures in the American Civil War? Important people during the American Civil War included Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, whose election prompted the secession of southern states, Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, Ulysses S. Grant, the most successful and prominent general of the Union, and Robert E. Lee, Grant's counterpart in the Confederacy. Why are Confederate symbols controversial? The modern usage of Confederate symbols, especially the Confederate battle flag and statues of Confederate leaders, is considered controversial because many associate such symbols with racism, slavery, and white supremacy. The flag was revived as a popular symbol in the 1940s and 50s by the Dixiecrat Democratic Splinter Group and others who opposed the American Civil Rights Movement. This video was prepared by using materials from various references and a major part from the website www.britannica.com, and we are thankful to all the writers who contributed to this.